In the iciness of 1965, an unusual and annoying scene unfolded inside the harbor of New York City. A French naval vessel arrived, now not to visit, and no longer to threaten warfare, but to conduct a business transaction that could shake the foundations of the worldwide economy. The deliverer was there to collect gold, loads of thousands and thousands of greenbacks well worth of solid gold bars. This was now not a robbery. It became a bank run. But the depositor became no longer a panicked citizen status in line out of doors, a neighborhood branch. The depositor was the Republic of France, and the bank became America of America. Inside the White House, President Lyndon Baines Johnson became furious. He reportedly referred to as the French President Charles de Gaulle an ungrateful vintage guy. He regarded this act as a betrayal, a stab within the lower back from an ally that the USA had liberated simply 2 decades earlier. But in Paris, Charles de Gaulle sat frivolously inside the Élysée Palace. He did not see himself as a traitor. He noticed himself as a whistleblower. He believed he changed into the best global leader brave sufficient to factor out the bare reality that the emperor had no garments, or instead that America had no gold. This occasion, known as the gold conflict, became the instant the post-world battle to financial order started out to crumble. It turned into the moment, while the promise that the United States dollar become as good as gold become tested and observed trying. To recognize why France dispatched warships to attack America greenback, we have to pass again to the beginning. We need to cross lower back to a resort in New Hampshire in 1944. The story begins at Bretton Woods. As the Second World War was drawing to a near, the Allied countries accumulated to determine how the sector economic system could work whilst the combating stopped. They desired to prevent any other Great Depression. They wanted balance. The United States held all the cards at that second. America had the handiest functioning enterprise left on Earth. It had the strongest navy, and crucially, it held 3 of all of the gold inside the world. The American delegates proposed a device that appeared logical at the time. They stated, "Let us make America greenback the middle of the universe." Every different currency, the French franc, the British pound, the German mark, would be pegged to the dollar. And the dollar would be pegged to gold at a hard and fast fee of $35 an ounce. It became an amazing gadget. It gave the arena self-assurance. If you held a US dollar anywhere inside the international, from Tokyo to Rio, you knew it was now not just a bit of paper. It became a declare, take a look at. You should an idea stroll into the United States Treasury and change that paper for shiny yellow metallic. The United States promised to change dollars for gold on call for any critical financial institution. It turned into the gold trendy, however, with an American intermediary. For 2 decades, this machine worked fantastically. It fueled the greatest financial growth in human records. Europe rebuilt itself from the rubble. Japan rose from the ashes. Trade flowed freely throughout the oceans. The greenback was king and all people wanted it. But there was a flaw inside the gadget. A fatal flaw that only a few economists and one cussed French preferred noticed coming. The flaw becomes simple math. As the sector economic system grew, countries wanted an increasing number of greenbacks to behavior alternate. To meet this demand, the United States had to print more dollars. This became excellent as long as the US had enough gold to lower back them up. But by way of the 1960s, the United States became printing bucks lots faster than it changed into mining gold. The printing presses have been going for walks warm. To pay for the Cold War, to pay for bases in Germany, and Japan to pay for aid to growing countries, and maximum expensively to pay for a growing struggle inside the jungles of Vietnam, and a huge welfare state at home called the Great Society. The United States turned into acting like a wealthy man who writes checks to each person he meets. Everyone takes the assessments, due to the fact they believe he's wealthy. But if everyone tried to cash those exams at the identical day, they would realize the account is overdrawn. This is in which Charles de Gaulle enters the story. De Gaulle was a lodge of history. He changed into the man who had led the Free French forces against the Nazis. He became a man of titanic pride and a deep suspicion of what he known as the Anglo-Saxon powers, which means America and Britain. De Gaulle believed that a kingdom without general independence become no longer a kingdom at all. He hated the idea that France needed to rely on the USA for its protection or its financial system. In the early 1960s, his economic advisors started out to expose him a few worrying numbers. They confirmed him that the United States changed into strolling a large balance of payments deficit. They explained that American corporations had been shopping for up French organizations, like Ford shopping for French automobile makers, or IBM taking up French computer firms. But they had been shopping for these real belongings with paper bucks that had been printed out of thin air. De Gaulle became outraged. He called this the Exorbitant Privilege. He argued that America had a superpower that no other kingdom had. If France wanted to shop for oil or metallic, it had to earn greenbacks through promoting wine or vehicles. It had to work for its money. But if America wanted to shop for something, it just printed greater green paper. It'd become a loose lunch on a worldwide scale. De Gaulle saw this not simply as unfair monetary competition, however, as a form of imperialism. He believed the U.S. turned into conquering the sector not with squatties, but with inflation. The tipping point got here in 1965. The United States became escalating the war in Vietnam. The fee turned into astronomical. The U.S. Federal Reserve was pumping money into the gadget to hold interest costs low and the economic system booming. Inflation becomes starting to tick up. De Gaulle found out that the USA dollar turned into efficaciously overvalued. It became trading at $35 an ounce of gold, but there were so many dollars in flow that the actual value became a whole lot decrease. He found out that the United States become essentially bankrupt in phrases of gold. It had promised to pay gold for every dollar. However, it had issued a ways more claims than it had property. It was the sector's biggest Ponzi scheme, and de Gaulle decided it changed into time to cash out. He did no longer try this quietly. De Gaulle turned into a master of political theater. On February 4th, 1965, he referred to as a press conference on the Elysée Palace. The room changed into packed with journalists from round the world. De Gaulle sat below the crystal chandeliers wearing his army uniform. He spoke in a sluggish, deep voice. He delivered a lecture on the records of cash. He told the world that gold changed into the only genuine money. He said, "Gold has no nationality. It is eternally and universally usual. It is unalterable fiducially." He declared that the time of the dollar's dominance become over. He introduced that from this present day ahead, France would no longer be given vague guarantees from America. France would exercise its proper beneath the Bretton Woods Agreement. It might take its reserves of U.S. greenbacks, hundreds of millions of them, and it might ship them lower back to the United States Treasury, and in exchange, it demanded the gold. This announcement sent surprise waves through the economic international. It changed into an assertion of economic war. De Gaulle turned into effectively calling America's bluff. He turned into shouting hearth in a crowded theater. He knew that if different international locations followed France's lead, the United States gold deliver might vanish in days. The reaction in Washington became a mixture of disbelief and panic. President Johnson tried to downplay the risk. He sent diplomats to Paris to talk de Gaulle out of it. They argued that this will destabilize the West. They argued that it might assist the Soviet Union. They appealed to the friendship between the two countries. But de Gaulle changed into unmoved. He famously stated that treaties are like young women and roses they last whilst they closing. The time of the dollar general had exceeded. The French government started out the logistics of the transfer. This was no longer a virtual transaction in which numbers move on a display screen. This became 1965. It turned into a bodily operation. The Banque of France accumulated pallets of U.S. dollar payments. They notified the USA Federal Reserve in their intention to redeem. The United States had no legal desire, however, to conform. If they refused, they could be admitting that the dollar become worthless, and the entire international financial machine might crumble instantly. So America Treasury opened the vaults at Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve. They started out to load heavy bars of gold onto vehicles. These bars have been preferred delivery bars. 400 Oz of natural 24 karat gold. They have been pushed to the docks and loaded onto ships. It is a pleasing picture to assume. In a generation of nuclear submarines and jet plane, the fate of the world economic system trusted heavy crates of metal shifting slowly throughout the Atlantic Ocean. The French Navy turned into concern to ensure the security of the shipment. This changed into the national wealth of France being repatriated. De Gaulle wanted the gold in Paris inside the vaults of the Banque de France, in which he could touch it. He did not consider the Americans to preserve it for him. He believed that possession changed into the best law that mattered as the primary. Shipments of gold arrived in French ports. The American media grew to become on France. They boycotted French wine. They poured champagne into the gutters. They called the French ungrateful. But de Gaulle did no longer care approximately popularity. He cared approximately reality. And the truth was that the American gold delivered turned into bleeding dry. In 1945, the United States held 20,000 lots of gold. By 1965, that quantity had dropped substantially. And now, with France taking massive chunks each month, the drain was accelerating. Other nations began to watch nervously. Germany, Japan, and Spain all held massive reserves of U.S. greenbacks. They were dependable allies of America, and they depended on U.S. military protection. They had been afraid to anger Washington. However, they had been also terrified of being the ultimate one conserving the bag. If France took all the top assets, what might be left for them? A quiet run on the financial institutions started. Central banks started out to covertly change their greenbacks for gold, trying no longer to make a scene like de Gaulle, but seeking to defend themselves, although the stress on the London gold pool, which became a mechanism utilized by Western countries to suppress the price of gold, became unbearable. The marketplace fee of gold wanted to go up, but the U.S. authorities changed it into selling gold to keep it at $35. They were bleeding reserves to keep a delusion. De Gaulle's attack turned into now not pretty much economics. It was a geopolitical maneuver. He desired to interrupt the American hegemony over Europe. He wanted Europe to be unbiased, a third pole in the bloodless conflict among the USA and the United States. He saw the dollar because the chain that sure Europe to American foreign coverage. By breaking the dollar, he hoped to free Europe. He was specifically important of the Vietnam War. He believed the conflict was unjust and doomed to failure. He argued that Europe became indirectly procuring the bombing of Vietnam because America published money to pay for the bomb. And Europe absorbed that inflation by means of preserving the bucks. By demanding gold, he turned into successfully defunding the American war gadget. The anxiety mounted in the course of the late 60s. The U.S. government tried the whole thing to forestall the bleeding. They imposed capital controls, stopping American citizens from making an investment overseas. They attempted to discourage tourism, to keep greenbacks at home. They pressured allies like Germany to signal agreements promising now not to transform their greenbacks for gold. The German chancellor famously received a letter from the USA threatening to withdraw American troops from Germany if they redeemed their bucks. It changed into essentially a protection racket. So we can defend you from the Soviets, however you must maintain our depreciating forex. Germany folded, France did now not. By 1968, the state of affairs become crucial. The United States had lost extra than one-half of its gold reserves because of the stop of World War II. The vaults were emptying at an alarming price. The French had efficiently repatriated heaps of gold. The American public became starting to get worried. There became talk of a greenback disaster. The fee of imports become rising. The inflation that Deal had warned about turned into arriving in American cities. The first, a part of de Gaulle's plan, had worked perfectly. He had exposed the weak point of the dollar. He had demonstrated that the emperor had no clothes. He had moved the bodily wealth of the West from New York to Paris. But he had also unleashed forces that he couldn't manipulate. He had started a fire that would subsequently burn down the whole residence of Bretton Woods. The machine became cracking. The markets had been smelling blood. The speculators had been gathering. And within the White House, a new president changed into approximately to take workplace. Richard Nixon became looking the gold drain with a chilly, calculating eye. He knew the sport became up. He knew America could not keep paying gold for all time. He found out he should make a preference among saving the dollar's popularity or saving the American financial system. And unlike the diplomats of the beyond, Nixon became now not afraid to flip the desk over. The degree became set for the very last collapse. The ships had sailed. The gold was in Paris. The dollars were flooding lower back to America, inflicting inflation. The entice that de Gaulle had sprung changed into closing tight across the U.S. economic system. But the Americans had one final card to play, a card that might alternate the nature of cash itself forever. De Gaulle wanted to go back to the gold general. He desired honest cash. But the U.S. changed into about to offer the arena something very distinctive. They have been about to sever the link among money, in fact completely. The gold struggle was approximately to show right into a fiat revolution. By the summer season of 1971, the economic warfare that Charles de Gaulle had released with his press convention 6 years earlier had reached a boiling point. The bodily transfer of gold from the USA to France had bled the American treasury dry. The visuals of French ships loaded with bullions cruising fire from New York were an embarrassment that the American superpower ought to now not tolerate. But de Gaulle's ambitious gamble had done greater than just embarrass the Americans. It had brought about a global loss of self-belief. The mystery turned into out. The United States did not have sufficient gold to cowl its debts. The run at the financial institution became no longer only a French operation. It had long passed worldwide. In London, the British government turned into quietly panicking. They noticed the same numbers the French saw. The British ambassador approached the USA Treasury with a polite, however devastating request. They wanted to convert $3 billion of their reserves into gold. They wanted to do it quietly to keep away from a panic. However, the sheer size of the request changed into the final straw. It turned into the equivalent of a third of the ultimate U.S. gold stock. If the USA paid the British, there might be almost nothing left. The vault at Fort Knox would be essentially empty. The American dollar, which became the foundation of global commerce, would be found out as nugatory paper. Richard Nixon became now the President of America. Nixon was not a person who cared deeply about monetary idea. He cared approximately electricity, and he cared about triumphing the following election. He looked at the situation and noticed a trap. If he stored playing by using the rules of Bretton Woods, the U.S. could pass bankrupt. He might ought to induce a big recession at domestic to prevent the inflation. He must cut spending at the Vietnam War. He could ought to reduce social packages. It would be political suicide. Nixon realized that America turned into being constrained by using the very device it had created. The promise to pay gold became a chain across the neck of the American economic system. So Nixon decided to break the chain. He determined to do something that no essential energy had ever performed in peacetime. He decided to default on the most critical financial promise within the International. He gathered his top advisors at Camp David, a secluded presidential retreat within the Maryland mountains. It turned into a secret meeting. The international press did now not comprehend it changed into occurring. Nixon's group, consisting of his Treasury Secretary, John Connally, debated the options. The conventional economists argued that they must keep the gold trendy. They argued that cutting the hyperlink to gold would break the dollar's credibility. They warned of chaos. But Connally, a difficult-speaking Texan, famously told the European efficiently that the dollar is our forex, but it is your problem. He argued for the nuclear option. Close the gold window. Stop the shipments. Tell France and Britain and the sector to get lost. On the night of Sunday, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted the wildly popular TV show Bonanza to deal with the country. He looked into the camera and added one of the maximum consequential speeches in economic records. He spoke approximately defending the dollar towards worldwide speculators. He blamed faceless financial forces for the disaster. And then, buried inside the middle of the speech, he dropped the bombshell. He introduced that he had directed the Secretary of the Treasury to droop quickly. The convertibility of the dollar into gold or different reserve property. He used the phrase briefly. It became a lie. The gold window might never open once more. The Nixon surprise, as it came to be regarded, changed into an earthquake. In Paris, the French authorities became shocked. They had won the argument, but they had lost the battle. De Gaulle had died the preceding Warrior. However, his successors watched in horror as the United States in reality changed the guidelines of the sport. France had wagered that gold changed into the ultimate money and that America might be compelled to subject itself to protect its gold reserves. Instead, America clearly declared that gold not mattered. They declared that the greenback became cash absolutely because the U.S. stated it become. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The forex markets shut down. Traders failed to understand the way to charge whatever. When they reopened, the price of the dollar plummeted in opposition to the French franc, the German mark, and the Japanese yen. This supposed that American items had become inexpensive, and overseas items became greater expensive. It became a large devaluation that harmed Europe and helped American manufacturers. It changed into exactly what Nixon desired. But for the French who have been sitting on piles of gold bars in Paris, it became a bittersweet victory. Yes, that they had their gold, and yes, the charge of gold skyrocketed. In the years following, the Nixon shock gold went from $35 an oz to over $800 an oz. The French treasury made a fortune on paper. Dex-Guilly's decision to shop for gold gave the impression of a stroke of genius. He had traded depreciating paper for an asset that exploded in cost. However, the deeper aim of de Gaulle had failed. He had desired to force the United States to be accountable. He had wanted to go back the sector to a system of honest money where international locations could not print their manor out of debt. Instead, his attack had forced the U.S. to sever the last link to truth. The international moved from a gold standard to a fiat well-known. In this new international, America did no longer need gold at all. It could print as many bucks because it wanted, and the world had no choice, however, to accept them due to the fact there has been no opportunity. The dollar remained the arena reserve foreign money no longer, as it became backed via gold, however, as it became backed by means of the United States Navy and the United States economic system. The consequences of this shift are still with us nowadays. The inflation of the 1970s became a direct result of this decoupling. Without the area of gold, governments round the sector commenced to print cash to solve every political trouble. The generation of stable charges became over. The generation of constant inflation had all started. For France, the gold conflict became the final notable act of defiance. With the aid of a European electricity towards American hegemony, it became the closing time, a Western best friend, dared to appear in Washington in the eye and say, "The ships that carried the gold across the Atlantic were the very last convoy of an older international, the international wherein cash was physical, where money owed needed to be paid, and to wherein a promise written on paper become expected to be venerated." The legacy of this event is profound. It taught the arena that the USA would continually act in its very own self-interest, despite the fact that it intended breaking its personal treaties. It taught developing nations that conserving dollar reserves was a hazard, because the guidelines should change in a single day. And it verified the cynicism of Charles de Gaulle, who always believed that international locations have no friends, most effective hobbies. In the cease, the gold struggle changed into a struggle among philosophies. The philosophy of gold represented by using France, which valued balance, records, and tangible property, and the philosophy of the dollar, represented with the aid of America, which valued flexibility, boom, and the electricity of the kingdom to manage the economy. The United States won the geopolitical warfare. The dollar remained king, however France gained the ethical argument. The instability, the debt disaster, and the inflation that have plagued the worldwide economic system since 1971 are the direct result of ignoring the warning that de Gaulle delivered in that press convention. Today, the gold that France repatriated nonetheless sits in the deep vaults of the Banque de France in Paris. It is one of the biggest gold reserves inside the world. It sits there as a silent monument to the time whilst France compelled the U.S. to pay its debts. It is a reminder of the short second when a French president dispatched his military to New York now not to conquer territory, but to capture the truth. The ships have lengthy due to the fact been scrapped. The politicians are lifeless, but the gold remains everlasting, unalterable and detached to the paper guarantees of empires. The gold conflict is over, but the question it requested stays unanswered. What is money clearly? Is it a promise from a government? Or is it a cold, hard piece of metallic that owes nothing to everybody? Charles de Gaulle made his desire, and looking on the mountain of debt the sector sits on these days, it's far hard to mention he turned into incorrect. I'm John, and that is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to live beforehand of the curve, due to the fact, while the record books are written, you will want to be most of the few who noticed it coming. Thanks for looking.